A 911 call, a black teenager just walking home. A white woman sees him, no reason needed, just the fear masked as vigilance. The police arrive, stop him, search him as if he were a criminal. But they don't know. His mother is an FBI agent. When she shows up, the power balance immediately shifts. Who is the real danger here? How many people haven't had anyone come to their rescue in time? Brookstone Estates is an upscale neighborhood on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. Everything here is maintained in an almost unnervingly perfect state. The lawns are meticulously trimmed, lush and green like a golf course. The smooth blacktop roads are free of cracks, winding between large houses with gleaming windows. The trees along the streets stand straight, swaying gently in the cool evening breeze. It all exudes an absolute order. A peaceful neighborhood so perfect it's almost suspicious. The sun is slowly setting, casting a soft orange glow across the scene. A light breeze sweeps past the red brick houses, carrying the scent of dinner being prepared for family tables. A perfect picture. Except for one odd thing. A black teenager is walking on the sidewalk, carrying a sports bag over his shoulder. Elijah Brooks, 16, just left the Franklin High basketball gym. Sweat still clings to his forehead, his sports shirt sticking to his tired back. His Nike shoes sink slightly into the smooth sidewalk of Brookstone as he walks, each step confident but somewhat hesitant. He adjusts the strap of his bag, tucks his earbuds in, and lets the music drown out the heaviness in the air. Today, he decided to take the shortcut through Brookstone. After a long practice, he just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. Taking the longer route would add another 20 minutes, while this path only took half the time. And anyway, he wasn't a stranger to this neighborhood. Jordan, his best friend, lived here. He had come over to play games, do group projects, crash overnight a few times, but that didn't mean he belonged here, not in the eyes of the residents of Brookstone. As he passed the houses with their expansive porches and spotless windows, Elijah began to feel something strange. He wasn't sure where it was coming from, but there was a subtle sensation. Something was watching him. He glanced around. The houses stood still, their windows glowing, but something felt off. A small dog in the distance barked twice and then stopped abruptly, as though it too sensed the change in the atmosphere. Elijah's heart raced a little faster. The music still played in his ears, but he no longer heard it. He looked up at a house on the left. The light inside flickered slightly, then quickly went out. Elijah took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy thoughts in his mind. Maybe he was imagining it, or maybe someone was watching him from behind a window. From the large window of a 2-story house, Linda Cartwright sat on a cream-colored velvet chair, holding a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea. Her eyes wandered over the quiet neighborhood in front of her, where the last rays of the afternoon sun stretched across the spotless streets, reflecting off the hoods of expensive SUVs parked neatly in front of each house. Linda had lived in Brookstone Estates for over 15 years, having witnessed neighbors come and go and becoming intimately familiar with the rhythms of the neighborhood. She knew who went for a morning jog, who walked their dogs in the afternoon, and who received packages every Tuesday. There was nothing happening in Brookstone that she didn't know about. But today, something unsettled her. A tall, broad-shouldered black teenager, the build of an athlete, was walking through the neighborhood with a sports bag slung over his shoulder. He wasn't moving slowly like the usual residents, nor did he seem to be strolling casually like the wealthy kids in the area. He walked briskly, decisively, but not hurriedly. More importantly, he didn't belong here. Linda furrowed her brow. She had never seen him before. She set her teacup down, leaned slightly forward, and kept her gaze fixed on the figure heading down the red brick road. He was looking around, glancing briefly at the houses, sometimes looking over his shoulder as if checking something. Linda's heart began to race. He was scouting. The thought hit her faster than her reason could process. Linda felt a surge of alertness, an instinct she had honed over the years of living in this neighborhood. A safe, upscale neighborhood, reserved for families who belonged, families she recognized, families she trusted. But this boy, he didn't belong. Linda blinked, trying to think more rationally. Maybe he was just an innocent kid passing through on his way home, like the other children around here, but what if not? What if he was planning something? What if tonight or some night a burglary appeared on the local news, and she'd had the chance to prevent it but did nothing? She had read too many stories about thefts. She had heard about people who weren't careful, people who thought nothing could happen, only to regret not being more cautious in the first place. A sense of worry flooded Linda's mind. She glanced at the phone sitting beside her teacup. Just one call. The police could come, check it out, make sure everything was safe. One call to keep this neighborhood unchanged. She reached for the phone. Her finger pressed the numbers so quickly that she didn't have time to think. 911. The phone rang. Operator. 911, what is your emergency? Linda, I want to report a suspicious person. Operator. Can you describe the individual? Linda. A black teenager. I've never seen him before. He's walking through my neighborhood looking around, seems like he's checking out the houses. Operator. Has he made any threatening moves? Does he have any weapons? Linda, hesitating. No, but he's carrying a bag. I don't know what's in it. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Operator. Did you see him try to enter any houses? Linda. Not yet, but I just think... I can't be sure. She couldn't be sure. But wouldn't it be better if the police came and checked? Operator. We'll send a patrol to check. Linda exhaled, placing the phone down, suddenly feeling lighter. She had done the right thing. But as her gaze returned to the window, watching the teenager continue walking, unaware of what awaited him, another thought crept into her mind. A thought she tried to ignore. Was she overreacting? The thought flashed through her, but Linda quickly pushed it aside. Better safe than sorry. Anyway, the police would just ask him a few questions and send him on his way if there was nothing to worry about. What Linda didn't know was that her call had just completely altered the teenager's evening. She didn't know she had set something into motion, something that could crush a life just because of one wrong decision. Linda hung up the phone, but her hand still gripped it tightly, as if it were the only thing protecting her from the vague unease creeping in her chest. The sense of anticipation remained, but it wasn't exactly fear. Rather, it was something deeper, a certainty that she had just done her duty, protecting the neighborhood from instability. She stood still for a moment, her eyes still focused on the outside. The young man was still walking, unaware that a small decision she had made had just changed his evening, perhaps even his life. Linda returned to the sofa, but the cup of tea had gone cold. She picked it up, took a small sip, but the faint bitterness no longer provided the familiar relaxation. Something felt off, but she immediately dismissed the thought. No, I did the right thing. If nothing happens, the police will just ask a few questions and let him go. If there's a real issue, at least I've done what's necessary to protect this neighborhood. She reached for the iPad on the table and opened the local news app. Normally, at this time, she would scroll through articles about new real estate projects or community meetings, but today she couldn't focus. Her gaze occasionally drifted back to the window, to the figure slowly disappearing down the end of the street. In the distance, a sound echoed. Not loud, but enough for her to recognize immediately. The siren of a police car. Linda straightened up, eyes wide. They were coming faster than she had thought. Not far away, in a white and blue patrol car from the Columbus Police Department, Officer Daniel Bennett gripped the steering wheel as the radio crackled with the dispatcher's even voice. Report of a suspicious individual, male, black, teenage, carrying a backpack. moving through the Brookstone Estates area. No obvious signs of criminal activity, but local residents report unusual behavior, possibly casing the area. Bennett shot a glance at his colleague, Luis Rodriguez, sitting beside him. He was almost a decade younger than Bennett, still fairly new to the job. Unlike Bennett, who had nearly 20 years in the field and was all too familiar with calls like this. Brookstone Estates, a black kid walking through that neighborhood. You guess, Bennett smirked. Rodriguez furrowed his brow. Do you think he's actually suspicious? Bennett shrugged, eyes still on the road. Look, I'm not saying they're all trouble, but I don't believe in coincidences. If someone feels worried enough to call the cops, I'm not ignoring it. Rodriguez didn't answer, but his eyes reflected clear hesitation. Bennett reached for the siren light, the short blast of the siren filling the air as he pressed the gas, the patrol car speeding toward Brookstone Estates. Elijah walked on, eyes fixed ahead, trying not to focus on the feeling of being watched that had lingered since earlier. But it was still there, hanging in the air, in the way the windows along the street seemed to darken every time he passed by. He took a deep breath, reminding himself there was no reason to be worried. He hadn't done anything wrong. This was just a shortcut, and if he walked a little faster, he'd be home without any trouble. But then, a sound broke the silence. A short siren blast. He froze. Turning around, he saw a police car coming up behind him. The flashing lights reflected red and blue on the road as it stopped right at the curb. The door opened. 2 officers stepped out. Bennett led the way, a middle-aged man with a muscular build, a stern face, but eyes that betrayed a rigid, emotionless demeanor. Rodriguez followed, his face younger, more hesitant. Both approached with their hands on their belts, where their guns were holstered. "Stop right there," Bennett said, his voice not loud, but enough to make the air feel heavy. Elijah stood still. His hand subconsciously tightened around the strap of his duffel bag. His heart raced, but he knew he had to stay calm. He slowly removed his earbuds, his gaze landing on the 2 officers. "What's going on, officer?" Bennett took another step, his eyes fixed on him. "We got a call about a suspicious person in the area. What are you doing here?" Elijah furrowed his brow, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just on my way home." "Where do you live?" Rodriguez asked, speaking for the first time. His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried an undertone of interrogation. Elijah swallowed. "A few blocks away." Bennett smirked, the kind of smile Elijah didn't like. "Is that so? Address?" Just as he was about to answer, he felt a strong pull on his shoulder. Rodriguez had grabbed his bag strap. "Can you hold on to your bag?" Elijah said, feeling a bit helpless as Rodriguez yanked it away from him. "Just checking," Bennett said, his tone indifferent, and then he crouched to open the bag. Sneakers, a sweaty basketball jersey, a water bottle, nothing else. Rodriguez glanced up at Bennett as if wondering whether they should keep going, but Bennett didn't move. "Why'd you cut through this neighborhood?" Elijah felt his chest tighten. He knew this wasn't going to be a simple check. "I'm just taking a shortcut," he said, his calmness starting to slip. Bennett didn't respond immediately. He stared at Elijah as if waiting for a slip-up, some small sign to justify the stop. But before he could say anything, another sound rang out. The sound of another vehicle approaching. Elijah glanced over his shoulder at the 2 officers. A black SUV sped up, stopping just a few steps away. The door swung open. A woman stepped out. Not hurried, not panicked. She walked toward them, her cold eyes scanning the situation in front of her. Elijah let out a relieved sigh. His mother had arrived. But the officers didn't know that the woman in front of them wasn't just a mother. She was an FBI agent. The black SUV glided smoothly over the red brick pavement. the lights from the vehicle reflecting on the windows of the two-story houses surrounding the street. When the car door opened, Denise Brooks stepped out, the sound of her high heels tapping lightly on the pavement, sharp like a knife cutting through the silence enveloping the neighborhood. She wasn't in a hurry, no panic. She didn't need to run. She wasn't a mother arriving in fear. She was a woman walking into a battlefield she knew all too well. Her cold gaze swept across the scene before her. Her son, Elijah, was standing still on the sidewalk, his hands hanging loosely but his body tense, like a bowstring ready to snap. Facing him were two officers, one holding her son's bag firmly, the other standing in front of him, his hand still near his waist where his gun rested in its holster. Denise felt her anger simmering in her chest, but she kept it under control. She knew that just one wrong step, one wrong word, and this situation could quickly escalate from a confrontation to a tragedy. Bennett glanced at her, his face hardening for a moment. He recognized her. Rodriguez stood beside him, a hesitant look on his face as if realizing that this might not be as simple as they first thought. But Bennett, with nearly 20 years in the field, wasn't easily swayed. Denise took a step forward, not rushing, but purposeful, like a panther moving toward its prey. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp like a knife. Rodriguez looked at Bennett, but he didn't show any sign of yielding the floor. "We got a call about a suspicious person in the area," Bennett said, his tone stiff. "He says he's on his way home, but we need to verify." Denise looked straight into his eyes without blinking. "A suspicious person?" she repeated, tasting each word. "Suspicious in what way?" Bennett didn't answer right away. Denise could see the momentary uncertainty in his eyes, but he quickly regained his stern demeanor. "He's carrying a bag, looking around as if he's scouting the area," he said. Denise slowly turned her head toward her son. "Elijah," she said, her voice unwavering, yet with a firmness that both officers could feel the weight of. "What's in your bag?" "My sports gear, Mom." Denise nodded, then turned back to face Bennett. "That's what he told you, right?" Bennett didn't respond. "Then why are you still holding my son's bag?" Denise continued, her gaze unshaken. Rodriguez softened his tone. "We're just checking to make sure—" Denise cut him off, her voice not loud but with an undeniable weight. "You said you received a call about a suspicious person. I want to know exactly what makes a 16-year-old wearing sports gear, carrying a gym bag, suspicious." Rodriguez opened his mouth but found no words. Bennett remained silent. Denise didn't take her eyes off them. She knew how situations like this could end. She had seen it too many times on the news. Too many families had lost their children over these so-called routine checks. She took a deep breath, then pulled out her phone, tapped a few times, and held it up in front of them. On the screen was a photo of Elijah, his student ID, and their home address. "My son lives here. This is his ID. This is his school information. He hasn't done anything wrong. He's not suspicious. He doesn't need to prove anything to you." Rodriguez instinctively looked down, as if reconsidering everything. Bennett, however, stood there, his eyes showing clear displeasure, but he couldn't come up with any reason to continue holding the boy. Denise continued, her voice still calm but cold. "So, now I'll ask you again. Why did you stop my son? Because he's suspicious or because someone didn't think he belongs here?" Silence hung in the air. Behind them, the door to a house opened. Linda stood there, her face pale. She had realized her mistake. Denise looked directly at Linda, and for a moment, the two women, one the caller to the police, the other the mother of the victim, faced each other in an undeniable truth. Linda wanted to say something to explain, to justify herself, but she couldn't find the words, and Denise didn't need to hear any words. She saw the truth in Linda's eyes. She turned back to Bennett. If you don't have a valid reason, I suggest you leave right now. Bennett pressed his lips together, his hands clenched, but he knew he had lost. Rodriguez silently let go of Elijah's bag, handing it back to the boy. He took it, gripping the strap tightly but saying nothing. Bennett turned away, not sparing Denise another glance, and walked back to the car. Rodriguez hesitated for a second, as if wanting to say something to Denise or Elijah, but then followed his partner. The police car rolled out of Brookstone Estates. Denise didn't look after them. She placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Are you okay?" Elijah nodded, but in his eyes there was still a lingering confusion that hadn't dissipated. Linda still stood there, looking as though she had just realized something too late. But any apology no longer mattered. Denise turned away, leading her son toward the SUV. She didn't need to say anything more. The truth was already crystal clear, and Linda knew she would never forget tonight. The car door slammed shut behind Denise Brooks, the sharp sound echoing through the quiet air of Brookstone Estates. The surrounding space seemed to tighten, the tension so palpable that one could almost feel every breath. The sky had darkened, the streetlights flickering on, casting a soft yellow glow onto the road, reflecting off the shiny black paint of the SUV that had just stopped. Denise wasn't in a hurry. She walked with a cold confidence, her high heels tapping lightly on the sidewalk, each step like a storm ready to form. Her eyes were sharp like a freshly honed blade, scanning the scene in front of her, every small detail collected as if it were second nature in her investigative work. Elijah stood still, not moving, but his hands gripped the straps of his bag tightly, his knuckles pale. Two police officers were still standing in front of her son, one cautious and hesitant, the other stubborn, trying to maintain control of the situation. Rodriguez spoke first, his voice calm but betraying a slight tension as he saw a woman like Denise Brooks approaching them with an unmistakable air of authority. "Ma'am, please keep your distance," he said, instinctively raising a hand, trying to control the situation. "We're handling a situation." Denise didn't stop immediately. She tilted her head, her gaze never leaving her son, then slowly turned toward Rodriguez. "Handling what?" Her voice wasn't loud nor urgent, but there was a weight to it that was almost terrifying. Rodriguez opened his mouth to speak, but Denise immediately cut him off. "Be more specific," she continued, her words deliberate as if each one was carefully chosen. "I want to know exactly what you're handling. A boy on his way home? A student with a school bag? Or are you handling someone's baseless fear?" Bennett froze at her question. He knew her. His eyes quickly scanned the surroundings, as if confirming that this was indeed the person he thought it was. And when he realized it, an uncomfortable sensation seeped into his muscles, making his face tighten. Denise Brooks, federal agent, a name well known in city press conferences, in anti-corruption investigations, and major cases handled by the FBI over the years. A woman respected but also disliked for her sharpness and uncompromising nature. Bennett subconsciously adjusted his posture, trying to appear more at ease. Rodriguez glanced at his colleague before turning back to Denise, attempting to explain himself. "Ma'am, we received a call from a resident in this neighborhood. She said the boy was acting suspicious, and we have a responsibility to check it out." Denise nodded slowly, as if processing each of his words. But instead of accepting the answer, she took a step forward, her eyes never blinking. "Suspicious," she repeated, her voice unchanged but heavy with an increasing tension. Rodriguez opened his mouth, but this time he didn't have a clear answer. Denise turned to Bennett. "Would you like to answer for your colleague?" Bennett didn't respond immediately. He tightened his grip on his gun holster, a habit he couldn't control when put in a defensive position. But Denise saw it. She had seen hundreds of officers like him before, those who felt they held absolute power, but the moment they were challenged by someone with more authority, they started to become uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, trying to sound confident. "We're just following protocol." Denise gave a thin smile, one that was devoid of humor. "Does your protocol include searching through a teenager's belongings without just cause?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying a heavier weight. Bennett didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Rodriguez as if hoping for some support, but his colleague was also starting to feel that this situation was spiraling beyond what he had anticipated. Denise didn't expect an immediate answer. She slowly pulled out her phone, tapped a few quick commands, and held up the screen for both officers to see. "This is my son," she said, pointing to the picture of Elijah in his Franklin High School uniform. "This is his student ID. This is our home address." She looked straight into Bennett's eyes, her voice colder than ever before. "Now, I'll ask again. Why did you stop my son? Because he's suspicious or because someone doesn't think he belongs here?" This time, no one answered. Rodriguez looked down, his eyes filled with uncertainty. As for Bennett, the self-assured air from before was gone, but he still clung to whatever last bit of authority he could hold on to. Behind them, Linda remained standing, witnessing the entire exchange. She knew this was her fault, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it. Denise turned around, her gaze sweeping over Linda. "Was it you?" she asked, her voice not loud, but enough to freeze the air. Linda opened her mouth but couldn't say a word. "You called the police?" Denise continued, each word emphasized as if to expose the whole truth. Linda felt her stomach twist. She wanted to say she meant no harm, that she was just worried, that this wasn't about race but about being cautious. But she couldn't lie to herself, because she knew exactly what had made her dial 911. And now, she was facing the consequences of that decision. Denise stood there, staring directly at her, no intention of leaving. For a moment, everything became eerily silent. The officers began to realize they had made a mistake. Linda began to realize she had made a mistake. But was it too late for regret? The space between them seemed stretched to the point where it was almost impossible to breathe. The police car lights continued to flash, the red and blue lights blinking in quick succession, reflecting off Denise Brooks's stern face. She stood tall, not backing down, her hand still gripping the phone with a bright screen displaying Elijah's information clearly, his student ID, home address, a photo taken with his mother at a community event. "This is my son," she said, each word as hard as steel. "He lives here. He's not some suspicious person." She stared directly into Bennett's eyes, unwavering, as if looking through him to the root of an issue he would never dare acknowledge. Bennett tightened his grip on the gun holster, an unconscious action of those familiar with using force as a tool for control. He cleared his throat, trying to remain calm but unable to hide the brief flash of confusion in his eyes. "We're just following protocol." Denise gritted her teeth. "What protocol?" "The protocol that makes a child be treated like a criminal right on their way home?" Rodriguez glanced at Bennett as though waiting for a direction, a confirmation that they still had control of the situation. But Rodriguez was no longer sure. What was supposed to be a quick check based on a dispatcher's report was turning into a tense standoff with an FBI agent. Denise took another step forward, closing the distance between herself and the two officers. Her voice was neither loud nor hurried, but there was an underlying threat that both of them could feel. "Do you have children, Officer Bennett?" He was slightly taken aback by the sudden question but maintained an even tone. "I don't see how that's relevant." Denise smiled coldly, no humor in her eyes. It is relevant. If one day your child was dragged out in the middle of the street, treated like a suspect with no reason, would you still call that protocol? Bennett didn't respond immediately. He blinked, his hand still gripping the gun belt. But this time it was not a sign of power. It was a form of defense. Denise never took her eyes off him. She knew he was struggling with his own thoughts, but he was too stubborn to admit it. Rodriguez, who had remained neutral until now, finally spoke up. "We really didn't mean to harm the boy. We're just responding to a call and following the instructions." Denise tilted her chin toward Elijah. "So, now that you've seen there's nothing suspicious, what are you going to do?" Rodriguez hesitated, looking toward Bennett as if seeking guidance, but Bennett remained firm, his ego too large to back down easily. "We just need to verify the boy's address and make sure he really lives here," he said, his voice less arrogant than before but still stiff. Denise raised an eyebrow, unable to hide the sarcasm. "What else do you need to verify? The address is on his student ID. If you need more proof, I can call the principal of Franklin High. Or, if you're still not satisfied, I can call the Columbus Police Department and have your superiors speak to me." Rodriguez paled slightly, but Bennett still didn't back down. He knew that if he retreated now, it would be a heavy blow to his pride. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice calm. "We don't want to escalate things, but I suggest you step back and let us finish the procedure." Denise crossed her arms, her eyes sharp. "I won't take one step back until you leave here." The air was thick, as if everyone was holding their breath. Elijah stood still, but inside, a surge of anger was rising. He hadn't said anything since his mother showed up, but the bitterness was stuck in his throat like something hard to swallow. He clenched the strap of his bag, trying not to explode. He knew that if he lost control, if he reacted too strongly, everything could get much worse. Denise could see that in her son's eyes, and it only made her angrier. She turned to Bennett again, her voice low but filled with authority. "Do you know how many black children have been stopped like this, just because someone feels they don't belong here? How many families have had to suffer the pain of a call like that? And how many times have people like you justified it by saying, 'We're just following protocol'?" Bennett couldn't respond. Rodriguez began to lose patience with his colleague. He turned to Bennett, his tone a bit sharp. "We've checked the bag, verified the identity. There's no reason to hold the boy any longer." Bennett bit his lip, his jaw twitching with anger. But he knew he had no reason to continue. He glanced at Denise one last time, his eyes filled with resentment and frustration, but then nodded toward Rodriguez. "Let's go." Rodriguez sighed and nodded. He turned to look at Elijah, then Denise. "Sorry for the inconvenience." Denise didn't respond, just silently crossed her arms and watched them, as if memorizing every expression, every gesture. Bennett turned and walked toward the patrol car. Rodriguez followed, his steps slower, as if he wasn't entirely convinced by how things had gone. When the car door slammed shut and the patrol car rolled away from Brookstone Estates, Denise stood there, never taking her eyes off them until they were out of sight. Elijah exhaled a long breath, as if a weight had been lifted off him. But Denise knew that this pain wouldn't just vanish. She turned to look at her son and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" Elijah nodded, but his eyes said he wasn't okay. The two of them stood there in silence as the darkness slowly enveloped Brookstone Estates. Not far away, Linda still stood on her porch, watching them with a pale face. For the first time in her life, she truly felt guilty. But would regret be enough? Linda stood motionless by the window, her eyes still fixed on the scene outside, where the two police officers had just left, and the woman she never expected was staring directly at her. Denise Brooks, not only the mother of the boy she had called the police on, but also an FBI agent, a woman with real power. A wave of dizziness washed over Linda as she realized the gravity of the mistake she had just made. She hadn't thought much when she dialed 911. It was purely instinctual, simply doing what she thought was right. But now, with everything laid bare, with the undeniable truth staring her in the face, Linda felt her stomach twist as if gripped by an invisible hand. She had called the police on the son of an FBI agent, not a criminal, not an intruder, but a child on his way home. Denise turned, her gaze unwavering, looking straight at the window of Linda's house. In that moment, Linda felt every bone in her body freeze. She wanted to step back, to pull the curtain shut, as if that could erase Denise's presence, as if she could rewind time and never have picked up the phone to call the police. But she knew, no matter how much she tried to hide, she couldn't undo the truth that had already occurred. Denise took another step forward, not needing to knock, not needing an invitation, simply standing there, her eyes full of authority, but not showing any anger. "Do you have anything to say?" Her voice was low and firm, not with the rage of an outburst, but with the cold interrogation of a questioning tone. Linda opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wanted to say something, a justification, an excuse, a phrase to soothe the guilt gnawing at her mind. But no words were enough to erase the reality. There was no way to deny the fact that she had called the police on a black child walking through her neighborhood. Linda was confused, her hand gripping the windowsill as if it were the only thing keeping her balanced. She stammered, but her words hung in the air. Denise stood there, unblinking, unmoving, unrelenting. Linda felt an immense pressure bearing down on her chest. She had never been looked at like this before, with such sharp judgment. Not with burning anger, not with loud accusations, but with a terrifying silence, one that forced her to face herself. "I didn't mean to." Linda finally spoke, but her voice was so small she could barely hear it herself. Denise raised an eyebrow, as if challenging her to continue. Linda felt a wave of panic rising. She couldn't avoid this any longer. "I just thought—" She swallowed hard, trying to sort out her thoughts. I saw the boy walking by and, I don't know, I felt something was off." Denise tilted her head slightly, a small but intimidating gesture. "Off?" Linda nodded quickly as if wanting to escape the situation as fast as possible. "I was just worried. I didn't know who he was. I thought—" Denise interrupted her, her voice sharp as a knife. "What did you think, Linda?" The way Denise said her name froze Linda in place. "You thought a black child walking with a sports bag was a threat?" Linda reflexively shook her head. No, I'm not like that. I didn't mean to." Denise sneered, but it wasn't a joyful smile. "You don't think you're like that?" she repeated, her tone questioning, as if inviting Linda to reconsider herself. Linda felt a growing sense of dread in her chest. She had always prided herself on being open-minded, on being a good neighbor, a mother, a wife, a member of the community. But right now, standing in front of another mother, one who had to leave her job to come protect her son from a situation Linda had unwittingly created, she realized that all the excuses in the world were meaningless. "I didn't think the boy belonged here," Linda said, but the moment the words left her mouth, she knew it was a lie. Denise smirked, her gaze never leaving Linda. "Didn't belong here?" Linda swallowed hard, realizing she had just admitted exactly what she didn't want to face. "You called the police on a black child," Denise said slowly, each word like a sharp knife cutting through the facade Linda had built to protect herself. "You didn't call because he did something wrong. You called because he was here." Linda couldn't respond. The silence stretched on, lingering like a sentence being slowly pronounced. Denise didn't need to say more. She had won. Not because she wanted to win, but because Linda had lost before this confrontation even began. She couldn't escape the truth. Linda blinked, feeling the sting at the corners of her eyes. For the first time in her life, she had to ask herself, "Who am I really? What have I done?" Denise still stood there, not leaving, not forgiving, not allowing Linda to escape the reality she had just forced her to face. In that moment, Linda realized that this night would haunt her forever. She had made it possible for a child to be arrested, hurt, or worse, just because of an invisible fear she couldn't even explain. The silence grew heavier. Denise finally turned and walked towards her son. But before leaving, she looked back, her eyes as cold as steel. "Next time, before you pick up the phone to call the police, ask yourself, what are you really afraid of?" Linda didn't say a word. She just stood there, silently watching the two of them walk away, feeling as if she had lost a part of herself that she could never get back. Linda stood frozen, her hand still gripping the phone that had connected her to 911, that had brought 2 police officers to the scene, that had made a child experience fear he should never have faced. She never thought things would go this far. She thought the police would come, assess the situation, ask the boy a few questions, then leave. But she was wrong. She hadn't considered the possibility that the boy could be shoved to the ground, handcuffed, and shoved into a patrol car just because of a baseless accusation. She hadn't thought about the scene of a mother having to drop everything she was doing to rush and protect her son from a system that had already deemed him a criminal simply because of his skin color. And worst of all, she hadn't thought that woman would be Denise Brooks. Denise took a step forward, not quickly, not aggressively, but with a weight that could not be ignored. "What did you think when you called the police?" Her voice was as sharp as steel, each word striking Linda's guilt like a knife. "Did you think my son doesn't belong here?" Linda parted her lips but couldn't speak immediately. She felt choked, as though an invisible hand was tightening around her throat. I just thought," she stammered, her eyes not daring to meet Denise's darkened gaze. "I wanted to protect the neighborhood." Denise let out a humorless laugh, but it wasn't friendly or forgiving. It was filled with disdain. "Protect who?" Denise tilted her head, not breaking eye contact with Linda. "Protect from what?" "A kid in sportswear on his way home after practice." Linda shook her head almost reflexively. "I didn't mean that." Denise raised her chin slightly, her eyes sharp as a blade. "Then what did you mean?" Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't threatening, but the pressure was so heavy Linda felt she could barely breathe. "Or don't you dare admit you're scared of him just because he's a black boy." Linda went silent. Those words fell like a verdict. Every excuse she had told herself, that she was just being cautious, that she only wanted to protect the neighborhood, that she wasn't racist, crumbled with one sentence. Linda couldn't deny it. She hadn't called the police because of any actual suspicious behavior. She had called the police because of her own feeling, a vague, unclear feeling, but strong enough to make her dial 911. A feeling that had been nurtured over decades of living in a society that whispered into her ear that children like Elijah didn't belong here. Linda tried to justify herself, but she didn't know what to say without sounding like a hypocrite. Denise stood there, waiting, not giving Linda a chance to escape. I saw him looking around. I was afraid he might." Linda hesitated, but then she couldn't continue. She couldn't finish that sentence without hearing herself repeat the same illogical reasoning so many others before her had used to justify themselves. Denise nodded slowly, as if she had already anticipated the answer. "So, you didn't see him do anything wrong. You just saw him looking around. And that was enough to make you call the police." Linda swallowed hard, feeling a sting of shame crawl under her skin. "Do you know," Denise continued, her voice growing deeper, more resonant but still sharp, "how many mothers like me have to talk to their children about how to survive in neighborhoods like this?" Linda furrowed her brow, but didn't dare interrupt. Denise didn't need her permission to keep going. "We have to teach our kids not to run in their own neighborhoods because people will think they're running from a robbery," she said, her tone becoming more biting. "We have to teach our kids to stand still when the police stop them, not to react, not even with the smallest movement because just raising a hand could get them killed." Linda felt her skin grow cold as Denise's words pierced through the layers of excuses she had once told herself. "We have to teach our kids how to survive," Denise finished, her eyes unwavering. "Because we know that if someone like you feels uneasy, our kids may never come home." Linda shuddered, because she knew that was the truth. Over the years, she had heard about similar incidents, stories about boys being stopped, shot, arrested without cause. She had once felt sad, even outraged, when reading about them, but she had never thought she would be part of the problem. But now, she was the problem. Linda felt a pang rise in her chest, a mix of shame, fear, and a painful realization of who she really was. She wanted to say that she didn't mean any harm. She wanted to say she was just doing what anyone else would do in that situation. But Denise had left no room for those lies. Had she ever thought about what would have happened if Elijah had been thrown to the ground? If the boy had been handcuffed? If things didn't stop here? Denise didn't say another word. She had said enough. She turned and strode back to the black SUV. Elijah followed behind her, but before getting into the car, he looked back at Linda, his eyes holding no anger or resentment. There was only a deep sadness. Only one question echoed in Linda's mind as she watched them drive away, the black SUV rolling into the night. What had she been afraid of? And worse yet, how many times had a call like hers ended differently? The atmosphere in Brookstone Estates was thickening, like a dense fog, making everything feel heavy and suffocating. The two police officers stood by, next to their patrol car, the sirens still flashing, but all the authority they once believed they had vanished the moment Denise Brooks stepped out of the black SUV. They knew they were facing a force that could not be easily subdued. Rodriguez glanced quickly at Bennett, his voice low but filled with worry. "What do we do?" Bennett didn't immediately respond. He was more tense than ever, feeling a cold sweat trickling down his back, though the weather was not hot. He didn't like this feeling at all. After years of being a cop, Bennett was used to controlling situations, deciding who was suspicious and who wasn't. But this time, he had no control. And that made him uneasy. He swallowed hard, leaned toward Rodriguez, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't do anything stupid. She's an FBI agent." Rodriguez nodded slightly, but his eyes still reflected concern. Denise's gaze locked onto them, her eyes sharp as a freshly honed blade, cutting through the confidence they had when stepping out of the patrol car just minutes ago. She tilted her chin, her voice calm but carrying the weight of a judgment. "Have you searched my son's bag?" Rodriguez hesitated, quickly glancing at Bennett, almost expecting some guidance. But this time, Bennett had nothing to direct. We only searched because we got a call," Rodriguez stammered, but his voice had lost its certainty. Denise interrupted immediately, not giving them a chance to sidestep. "Is a phone call enough to turn a child into a suspect?" Rodriguez instinctively tightened his gun belt, a subconscious habit when he felt cornered. But he had no response. Bennett bit his lip. He knew there was nothing he could say to justify his actions, because Denise didn't need them to say anything. She already knew everything. She had seen their eyes when they got out of the patrol car. She had seen the smugness in the way they checked Elijah's bag with no reason other than the color of the boy's skin. She had seen hundreds of men like Bennett before. Those who always thought they could make the rules with a raised eyebrow, a glance, an unfounded phone call. Denise took a step forward, closing the distance between her and the two officers. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to threaten, because she knew she wasn't the one in the weaker position. She knew they were the ones who were scared. She stared straight at Bennett, her eyes unblinking, unwavering, with not a hint of trembling. "Do you know what scares me the most?" Her voice was even, but there was an invisible pressure in it that made both officers uncomfortable. Bennett didn't answer, but he felt each word she said like it was being carved into his skin. Denise continued, her voice unchanged, but her gaze growing sharper. "I'm not afraid of people with guns. I'm not afraid of men like you. I'm not afraid of someone pointing a weapon at me." She paused just long enough to create a tense silence. "I'm afraid of people like her," she said, nodding toward Linda, who was still standing frozen at her window. Both Bennett and Rodriguez involuntarily turned to follow her gaze. Linda flinched, as if she had just been stripped bare of her thoughts in front of Denise. Denise continued, her gaze unblinking. "The ones who call the police without a real reason. The ones who convince themselves they're protecting the neighborhood, when in reality they're just protecting their own fear." Linda lowered her head, but Denise didn't stop. "And I'm afraid of people like you," she said, turning to face the two officers, her voice as sharp as steel. "The ones who show up when they get a call, ask no questions, need no evidence, no proof." Rodriguez pursed his lips, but he had no retort. Bennett began to feel a surge of anger rising within him. He wasn't used to being talked to like this. He was too accustomed to giving orders, not standing still and listening to someone question him. But Denise didn't care how he felt. She took a step back, her eyes still fixed on them like a warning. "This time, I made it in time," she said, her voice unwavering. "But what if I hadn't gotten here in time?" Her words fell into the air like a thunderclap. Neither officer had an answer, because they both knew the answer. Elijah could have been handcuffed. Elijah could have been thrown to the ground. Elijah could have been shot, just because someone thought he was pulling out a gun when it was actually just a phone. And in that moment, Rodriguez realized that this wasn't an unusual situation. This was just another normal day for kids like Elijah. Denise turned around, not needing to look back again. She had said enough. Bennett clenched his teeth, but he knew this confrontation was over. He had lost, not because Denise had raised her voice, not because she had more power than him, but because she had made him see the truth he had deliberately ignored for years. But would he change? Or would he simply try to forget this truth, like every other time before? Elijah stood still, his entire body frozen in the stifling air of the Brookstone Estates evening. The streetlights cast a pale yellow glow onto the pavement, blending with the flashing red and blue lights still blinking from the police car, creating a picture of unease. Everything around him seemed to move in slow motion, with each gentle breeze carrying the lingering tension from what had just happened. In his mind, all the images from the moments before were still vivid, from the moment he was stopped, to the sharp look in his mother's eyes as she stepped out of the SUV, to the way the two officers suddenly lost control when they realized they had made a mistake. Yet, the only thing that lingered within him was not anger or fear, but an indescribable emptiness. A deep, cold void, as if some kind of hole had been carved into his heart, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't fill it. This feeling wasn't new, but it had never been so clear, never so real as it was now, standing here, in this peaceful neighborhood to which he didn't belong, looking at his mother's face and realizing that no matter how strong she was, She couldn't change the reality he had just faced. He took a deep breath, but the air felt heavy in his chest, not filling him enough to make him feel any better. His hand gripped the strap of his bag, his knuckles turning white, as if loosening his hold even slightly would make everything shatter into pieces. He looked up at his mother, his eyes no longer filled with fear or worry, but with a deep concern, a question that had formed the moment the police car had stopped behind him, a question he had tried to suppress but could no longer ignore. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke, but each word echoed in the space, cutting through the cold winds, reaching everyone present, making Denise, Linda, and even the two police officers hold their breath. "Mom, what if you hadn't gotten here in time?" That question wasn't just words. It was the crystallization of a reality that Elijah had been forced to face. It wasn't a distant scenario or an unfounded fear, but a situation that had happened countless times to people like him. Those who weren't lucky enough to have an FBI agent for a mother. Those who had been dragged away, handcuffed, slammed to the ground, or even shot just because someone thought they looked suspicious, just because they stood in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong skin color. Denise felt her heart tighten the moment she heard that question. She had known this day would come, that her son would one day realize that the world doesn't treat everyone the same, but she never thought it would happen so soon. Never thought she would have to hear her own son ask this question right in front of their house, while the wound hadn't even healed yet, while he hadn't fully escaped the threat that had surrounded him. She knew she couldn't lie to Elijah, couldn't pretend that the world was more fair than it really was, couldn't say that all cops were good, that as long as he behaved properly, her son would always be safe. Because she had seen too many people do everything right and still not escape tragedy. She had witnessed too many families bury their children, just because someone decided they didn't deserve a chance to live. Her hand tightened on her son's shoulder, a gesture both to comfort him and to comfort herself, because she too was struggling with her own fear, the fear that any mother of a son like Elijah carries with her for life. She wanted to tell him that she would always protect him, that she wouldn't let anything happen to him, but she couldn't, because the truth was, she couldn't always be there at the right moment, couldn't always rush to his side like she had today. And that was the thing that scared her the most. She bent down slightly, bringing her gaze level with Elijah's, so he knew she wasn't avoiding his question, wasn't ignoring the worry he was feeling. She took a deep breath, then slowly, with all the sincerity she had, she said, "But I did come." She knew that wasn't a complete answer, not something Elijah truly needed to hear, but it was all she could say at that moment. And she hoped, even just a little, that it would help him feel less burdened. Elijah didn't respond immediately. He looked at his mother, his gaze deep as if trying to find something, some certainty, some assurance that he would be okay, that next time, if something similar happened, his mother would appear again and save him from it. But he knew no one could promise that, no one could guarantee that he would always be as lucky as he had been today. He knew his mother had come, but he also knew that there were those who weren't as lucky as him, those who didn't have anyone to save them in time, those who didn't have a chance to ask this question. He lowered his head, gripping the strap of his bag a little tighter, as if that was the only way he could hold on to his calm. He didn't want his mother to see the pain in his eyes, didn't want her to worry even more. But Denise saw it, and that made her feel a pain greater than anything she had ever experienced in her life. The night wind blew gently, but it wasn't enough to chase away the cold feeling creeping into the minds of both mother and son. Denise knew this was just one of many times Elijah would have to face this truth, that today was only the beginning of a series of encounters he would never be able to avoid, and the only thing she could do was teach him how to survive, how to endure, how to stay safe in a world that would always see him as a threat, even if he was just a boy on his way home. Elijah didn't say anything more, but he knew, and his mother knew. This time she had come. But what about the next time? Linda stood there, her back pressed against the door, as if it was the only thing holding her from collapsing to the floor. The silence of the neighborhood no longer brought the sense of peace it once did. It was thick, suffocating, wrapping around her like an invisible chain tightening around her throat. The yellow streetlights cast their pale glow on the pavement, illuminating her ghostly face, reflecting the horror that had just taken root in her mind. Just one phone call. A call from a woman in a luxurious home, sitting comfortably in her armchair, holding a cup of tea, gazing out the window. A call that lasted only a few minutes, words spoken casually, as if they carried no weight at all. But now Linda realized just how heavy that weight was. A call that could get Elijah arrested. A call that could send the boy crashing to the ground, handcuffed, dragged into a police car with no one to protect him. A call that could mean the boy would never come home again. She had never thought about that until now. Her heart pounded, a rapid and erratic beat as if trying to wake itself from a nightmare. But this was not a nightmare, this was reality. Her throat was dry, her hands ice cold, and in that moment she knew she had to say something. She had to say something. Her voice emerged, weak, almost just a breath. I'm sorry. Denise turned to look at her. Her eyes held no emotion, no blazing anger, no shouting or accusations, no hatred, just a cold emptiness. An emptiness that hurt Linda more than any reprimand. Denise spoke, each word sharp and steady, like the edge of a knife. Sorry for calling the cops? She tilted her head, eyes never leaving Linda. Or sorry because you now feel ashamed? Linda stiffened. This was not a simple question. It demanded absolute honesty. It didn't allow her to dodge. Linda felt her whole body tremble, not because she was afraid of Denise, but because she was afraid of what she had just realized about herself. She had never thought of herself as this kind of person. Never thought she could be the type to call the police just because she saw a black boy walk past her house. Never thought she could be the type to unknowingly contribute to a system that could take a child's life just because of their skin color. But she had done it. And now, there was no denying it. She had no answer. Linda opened her mouth, but no words came out. She just stood there in silence, feeling everything she had once believed about herself start to crumble. Denise still didn't look away, but she didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Linda had already figured it all out. For years, she had believed she was a good person, someone who never used racist language, someone with black friends, someone who supported movements for justice. But in that moment, she could not deny that she, too, had become part of the problem. Not because she hated anyone. Not because she intentionally wanted to cause harm, but because she had never questioned her own fear. It was buried deep within, seeping into her thoughts in ways she didn't even recognize. It was built from growing up in a neighborhood full of people just like her. It was nurtured by the 6 o'clock news, where images of criminals were almost always people who looked like Elijah. It was reinforced every time someone whispered about a dangerous area of the city, even though she'd never set foot there herself. It made her believe she was doing the right thing, even when it was, in reality, a cruel act. Linda began to shake. Not because Denise was staring at her, but because she was now forced to face herself. For the first time in her life, she could not escape the truth about who she was, and it hurt more than anything she had ever experienced. Denise finally turned away, as though she had gotten the answer she needed. Not from Linda's words, but from her silence. And that silence spoke volumes. Linda stood there in the darkening street, feeling a crack form inside herself. A crack she didn't know if she could ever heal. In the space after the tense confrontation, Bennett sighed, a deep breath filled with both disappointment and exhaustion from the moments of pressure. slowly adjusting his gun belt as if trying to reclaim some of the power he felt was being eroded. The silence seemed to stretch on endlessly as everything around them appeared motionless, leaving only the faint flicker of police lights, painting a somber, haunting picture of helplessness and despair. Bennett spoke in a quiet tone, yet one tinged with irritation. "If there are no issues, we'll be leaving," he said, trying to maintain the professionalism honed over years in the force, but his voice carried an undeniable sense of frustration with the system he once believed in. A system built to protect and serve justice. In that moment, when everything seemed meaningless in the face of truth, both Bennett and Rodriguez felt the heat of the situation creeping under their skin, making it impossible to hide the unease and inner conflict they both felt. Without hesitation, Denise responded with a faint smile, her cold, contemptuous gaze as if mocking those she believed had committed an unforgivable mistake. "Is that all?" she said, her voice not raised but powerful enough to make the air itself seem to shudder with each word. "After making my son feel like a criminal in his own street, do you think that's the procedure you follow?" Her words were sharp, cutting through any justifications the two officers might have, filling the air with such suffocating tension that everyone could feel their own breath. Rodriguez, in a moment of confusion, unable to hide his discomfort, stammered, "We're just following procedure?" His words fell like an excuse, dissipating into the heavy silence, as if he were questioning whether anyone but himself felt that things were going wrong, that the procedures he had trusted might be nothing more than a false framework built on undeniable prejudices. In response to his weak words, Denise didn't allow Rodriguez the chance to continue, interrupting him with a cold tone, as though each word was carefully chosen to expose the raw truth. "Does your procedure include discrimination?" That question was not merely a rebuke, it was an accusation, a challenge to the system itself, rendering both officers powerless before her sharpness. In that moment, silence enveloped the space, a silence that seemed to contain all the reproach and pain of families who had suffered oppression and prejudice, making any justification meaningless. The two officers, once confident and resolute in situations they were familiar with, now stood there, unable to say a word that could reassure or defend their actions, as though they, too, were silently blaming themselves for participating in a system that had lost its humanity. Finally, with no words left to continue the confrontation, Bennett and Rodriguez returned to their patrol car, their steps heavy and silent, as if each step was an unspoken apology, a surrender of everything they once believed in. The car door slammed shut behind them, the sound marking the end of a chapter they would not be proud of in their own story, and the vehicle rolled away from Brookstone Estates, leaving not only a heavy echo but also questions left unanswered, a void they would carry for the rest of their lives. In that moment of silence, the surrounding space seemed emptier, as though everything stood at an irreversible crossroads where the decisions of the past, whispered words, and the consequences of invisible prejudices would become burdens no one could escape. The feelings of those who had once stood in Bennett and Rodriguez's shoes seemed insignificant and powerless as they faced a truth no justification could cover, the absurdity of actions they once thought were a standard procedure. As the police car disappeared from sight, the sound of its departure lingered in the minds of the witnesses, making the pain and injustice seem to hang in the cold night air of Brookstone. Unasked questions, unresolved reproaches, and the deep-seated fear from past events flooded back, as though to remind them that, even for just a moment, ignorance and prejudice could strip a child of the chance to live freely, to return home with faith in a fair world. Meanwhile, in a shadowed corner of the street, Linda stood alone, her eyes empty and filled with regret, clearly sensing that what she had done was not just a minor mistake, but a dangerous threat to the survival of innocent lives. She felt the weight of responsibility, realizing that every decision, every action, even a simple phone call, could change someone's fate forever. Amidst the heavy, chaotic silence, all that remained was a harsh truth no one could deny. The system they represented, with all its procedures and regulations, was sometimes nothing more than a double-edged sword, capable of severing the bonds between people, between trust and hope, between life and death. Bennett and Rodriguez left without offering further explanations, leaving in their wake not just a heavy echo in the hearts of the witnesses, but a resonating question, making the night in Brookstone not only a night of flashing police lights, but also a night of injustice, of hidden wrongdoings and actions no one dared to speak up against. Those memories would remain forever as a reminder that prejudice, even for a moment, could change the course of someone's life. As darkness enveloped the area, the air grew colder. Everything seemed covered in a thick fog of regret and remorse, leaving those who once lived in the confidence of authority with only a numbing sensation, as though they had stepped into a dead end, a place where everyone would pay for their thoughtless actions. It was then that the sounds of the night in Brookstone, the footsteps, the rolling cars, and the sighs of a helpless system merged into a sad melody, making anyone who listened feel their heart contract in an unending sorrow. And in that very moment, even those who were mere bystanders realized that everything had changed forever, that injustice could no longer be hidden with empty words or hasty justifications, but could only be exposed through the silence of those who listened. As everything faded into oblivion with the night's noises, only a lingering echo remained in everyone's mind, a reminder that every action, every decision, no matter how small, could become a shattered piece of a life, and that the system we live in can only be changed when those brave enough to face the truth never turn away from it. The atmosphere in the car was thick, heavy, as if every sound had been swallowed by the extended silence. The engine of the black SUV hummed softly as Denise accelerated, leaving Brookstone Estates behind, but the feeling inside the car was completely opposite, like a storm was brewing, waiting to explode at any moment. Elijah sat still in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the window, though he wasn't really seeing anything. The streetlights passed by in the darkness, casting fleeting shadows across his face, but in his mind, only images from the recent encounter replayed over and over, like an endless reel of film. The police car had parked behind him. Bennett's cold, shouting voice, Rodriguez's firm hand yanked at his bag without asking. The anxiety, the rapid heartbeat, the feeling of breathlessness when he realized that just one wrong move, just one person deciding not to believe him, could end his life right there. These thoughts crept into his head, sinking deep into his cells, like a pain that could never be erased. Denise gripped the steering wheel, her eyes still focused on the road ahead, but inside, her mind was in turmoil. She was used to tense situations, had faced real dangers before, had stared into the eyes of criminals she had hunted. But she had never felt the sense of powerlessness like this. Because this time, the target of the confrontation wasn't her, it was her son. A child. A boy who should never have had to learn how to deal with the police just to get home safely. She took a deep breath, lowering her voice, trying to stay calm. "Are you okay?" Elijah didn't turn to look at her, his eyes still on the scene outside as if searching for something he didn't even know. "I don't know." His words were soft but heavy, as if even he wasn't sure whether he was truly okay. Denise wanted to tell him it was over, that he was safe, that he didn't need to worry anymore. But she knew that if she said that, it would be a lie, because it had never really ended. This moment would never leave him. It would follow him every time he stepped out of the house, every time someone stared at him too long, every time he had to wonder whether he should run across the street, worried that someone might think he was running from something. Elijah clenched his fists in his lap, finally turning to his mother, his eyes deep and full of thought. "Mom, how many others were like me, but no one showed up in time?" Denise felt her heart sink. She knew this question was coming, knew that one day her son would realize the truth that millions of black people had faced for generations. But what hurt her most was that she didn't have an answer good enough to ease that pain. She couldn't lie to her son. She had seen too many names, too many faces, too many families with no one there in time to save their sons. Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, George Floyd, Sandra Bland. And how many more names? How many others had found themselves in Elijah's situation with no one to come to their aid? How many had never made it home just because someone felt uneasy? Denise gripped the steering wheel tighter, her eyes still on the long road ahead, but her mind was lost in a bitter reality. She wanted to say Elijah was lucky, but was that really luck when a child had to rely on an FBI agent's intervention just to avoid being labeled a criminal on his way home? She wanted to say something, but her throat closed up. How could she tell her son that other mothers of children just like him had tried to get there in time, only to bury their children instead? How could she tell him that this system didn't care who he was, didn't care how smart, kind, or hard-working he was, it only saw the color of his skin? Denise turned to look at Elijah, then back to the road ahead. She had no answer, and Elijah didn't expect one. He just wanted his mother to understand that he had realized something he didn't want to believe was true. The car kept moving, leaving behind a neighborhood with lit-up houses where people were still enjoying their evening as if nothing had happened. But for Elijah, for Denise, for anyone who had gone through what they just went through, this evening would never be the same again. Elijah rested his head against the window, closing his eyes, but in his mind the questions kept ringing. How many others didn't have anyone show up in time? How many times had a call like Linda's taken someone's life? How many more times will this happen before things really change? He didn't know. Denise didn't know, but both of them understood that they would never forget tonight. Brookstone Estates returned to its usual tranquility, with the soft yellow lights on the steps still flickering as if nothing had happened. The luxury cars were still neatly parked on the driveways of the perfect homes, and the trees lining the street still rustled in the light breeze of the early evening. But inside one house, everything was no longer the same. Linda sat motionless on the sofa, her empty eyes staring at the phone screen, where her 911 call was still saved in the recent calls list. She gripped the phone tightly, but now it was no longer an inanimate object. It felt heavy in her hands, like proof of a decision she could not take back. She felt nauseous. Why did she do that? What was she afraid of? Elijah did nothing wrong. She was the one who was wrong. Linda took a deep breath, but the air could not fill her chest like it usually did. A strange feeling, a painful awakening, crept into every cell of her body. She had lived so many years without ever asking herself this question, without thinking about what she had just done, because she had never had to face the consequences of her actions. But today, everything was no longer as simple as before. She reopened the 911 call on the screen, her eyes focused on the 3 short digits that held the power to change a person's life. She hadn't thought much when dialing that number. She didn't hesitate when she told the operator that a suspicious boy was walking in her neighborhood. She hadn't considered the consequences of her words, because in her mind those actions were reasonable, responsible, and protecting the neighborhood. But now she knew that all of it was just an excuse. She didn't protect anyone. She only protected her own ignorance. She was just trying to justify the fear she had never dared to face. Linda turned off the phone screen, but the question still echoed in her mind, a question she was asking herself for the first time in her life. What if the danger wasn't him, but me? That question shattered everything she had ever believed about herself. She always thought of herself as a good person, a responsible resident, a mother, a respected member of the community. But now she was no longer sure. because a truly good person would never have done what she did. Linda shuddered, feeling as if she had just shed a layer of armor she had unconsciously carried for so long. An armor that hid unspoken prejudices, unconscious assumptions she had never questioned. She stood up from the couch, her legs weak from everything she had just been through. She slowly walked toward the window, looking out at the road where just a few hours ago she had watched Elijah as if he were a threat. Now, the road was completely empty, with only the long shadows of trees stretching across the pavement, and in that darkness, Linda saw her own reflection in the window pane. But she no longer recognized the woman looking back at her. On the other side of the city, the black SUV rolled toward Denise and Elijah's house. In the passenger seat, Elijah still stared out the window, but this time, his gaze was no longer lost like before. In his mind, he knew he could never go back to the way things were. Some lessons come not through books or teachings, but through moments that shake their entire world. And tonight, Elijah had learned an unforgettable lesson. A lesson about the cost of an unfounded accusation. A lesson about how just one small decision can completely change a person's fate. A lesson about the injustice that still exists, even when people try to pretend it's gone. Elijah didn't want to accept it, but he had no choice. Denise gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes focused on the road ahead, but he knew his mother was thinking deeply. He knew she wanted to protect him, keep him away from this pain, but she also knew she couldn't, because this world doesn't let them do that. The car passed a brightly lit sign by the road, advertising a newly built upscale neighborhood with the slogan, "A safe place for your family." Elijah smirked, but the smile had no joy. Safe for whom? That question echoed in his mind, and he knew he would never see the world the same way again. And perhaps neither would Linda. Nights like this change people. They don't leave scars on the skin, but they carve deep into the mind. Both Elijah and Linda knew they would never forget tonight, and perhaps that's the most important thing. But this story doesn't just stop at Brookstone. It happens every day, everywhere, with different names, different neighborhoods, different calls, but the result is always the same. How many times has another Elijah had no one come to his aid? How many times has the silence of people like Linda allowed this to continue happening? And more importantly, if one day you are faced with a choice like Linda's, what will you decide? If this story made you think, please like, share, to spread this message to more people, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. We may not be able to change the past, but we can choose how we will act in the future. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.